This is, I think, what's really tricky about both the brain and AI. We don't know what that next level is.
We created tools to help us advance, to eat more calories. We invented fire. We invented artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Do you think there are implications for this technology to elevate human cognition?
It made me realize, as humans, we definitely come up with new ideas, right? As you said, we build tools, we do these things to help us. AI is really, really good at dealing with a lot of information, putting it together and mixing it around in ways. And that is a part of creativity. That partnership is going to be really key. It's going to be our question asking mirrored with AI's ability to just deal with huge amounts of data and point us in directions we may not have thought. I am definitely in the camp of we've got to colonize space.
Joining me today is Professor Michael Dennin. He is a professor of physics and astronomy at UCI. Welcome to the program, Dr. Dennin.
It's great to be here. I'm very excited. I look forward to our conversation.
Likewise, I've been watching your talk on YouTube about the intersection of faith and science, and it is fascinating. And it's kind of like, as I was telling you offline, that this is an area where I find myself very much interested in. I don't know if it's the age thing. As we start growing older, we start like looking deep into the meaning of life, and
right.
But yeah, fascinating stuff. Can you tell us more about yourself, your interests, because also you are a big fan of making science accessible to all. So just briefly about your yourself.
Very much so. I think a couple things, as you said, I'm a physics professor. I've been doing that part for, 26 plus years, postdoc, PhD before that. My physics interest is in complex systems, and it'll actually be relevant to some of the stuff we talk about, I think. I have, I was born and raised Catholic, but my mom is Jewish, as you mentioned, long interest in science, religion, faith, and how they intersect with each other. Led to a book, Divine Science, Finding Reason at the Heart of Faith. YouTube videos, as you mentioned, watching. But I also just love talking about science with people, and a lot of public outreach, talking on science. It's led to course on science and superheroes that I did. It's led to me be on TV in a lot of different areas. One thing I'm having a lot of fun doing now is a podcast, FGGBT, fascinating gadgets, gizmos, and gear-based technology. We like to say we make your favorite fictional science and technology a reality. So it's me with two other guys, Daniel J. Glenn and Ben Siepser, and we just talk through things from TV, movies, video games. It's most fun when we make things that you think could be completely fake, and we explain how they might actually be real with very little stretching of the truth. So it's a lot of fun to do. And a lot of what we do there kind of intersects with some of the questions we're talking about here, with AI and brain and technology. So I just like to say I get to have a lot of fun in my life. Physics really is fun. So that's the great part of it.
Yeah, likewise. I think learning in general is so much fun, especially when we are in a point of life where we are, subjected to technology that makes us question what it means to be human, for example. And this is pretty much the purpose of this podcast. As soon as start reading more about AI, I felt that there's a need to have a discussion in society about the implications of this technology. So, and I'm so much interested in the emergent properties that you research. And this is quite relevant for the AI sphere. A lot of the scientists that I listen to have described the moment in their career where they are, putting a bunch of data in these neural nets and bunch of data, bunch of compute and scaling. And all of a sudden, the model knows how to code. The model knows Japanese. And these are all emergent properties that they did not anticipate in the first place. So I'm thinking to take this to another level. Could consciousness be the new or the next breakthrough emergent abilities or properties for these AI systems?
That's an interesting question. And I think there's one thing that's tricky about emergence is the different levels of it. And not to necessarily pick on the AI researchers, but I do think sometimes they stretch words like, it knows, it learns. There is a level of emergence there. And I like to talk about it always first in terms of what I actually study, which are foams and bubbles, because I find it's a very simple and clean place to think about it. when we really think about emergence, you're really thinking about a property that you can't explain from the underlying pieces. And so if you're familiar with, most people are familiar with shaving cream or whipped cream or lots of other foams. And what's cool about shaving cream is it can act like a solid. It can hold its shape. You spray the shaving cream out of the can and you get a blob of shaving cream in your hand. If you were to study the molecules, every molecule in that foam is either in a gas or a fluid state or a liquid. They're all fluids. They all flow. There is no way from just knowing the molecules and their behavior that you can predict the foam would be a solid. You need to know that from how the bubbles interact with each other. So it's an emergence. It's a complexity level. So consciousness is a natural candidate for saying, okay, you get enough complexity in your neurons and you get consciousness. But it's not quite as simple as just that. There's kind of the nice thing about emergence in physical systems, we really do know what the new kind of connections and rules are. We know how bubbles interact with each other. So it's not just simply, it was so complex, we got something we didn't expect. We have a new level at which we can understand it. And this is, I think, what's really tricky about both the brain and AI. We don't know what that middle level or next level really is in either case. And this is particularly true with AI. And I think it's the piece that we often forget. We train AI to do stuff. Every now and then it does something we didn't quite expect from the training. But that's partly because by design, unlike other computer systems, AI does have a little bit of a black box space to it. It has, the best way to describe it, I like to say is, it has this kind of random element where it has a whole bunch of data. We tell it when it's getting things right, but we don't know why it's getting it right. And it doesn't know. It just knows it's getting it right. And then it can use it to get things right in the future. That's a confusing English sentence, but I think we have to be careful not to call it clear emergence until we understand what's happening at that next level.
Right. But
I can say a lot more about that, but I'm going to pause there to let you ask another question to make it more clear.
No, the natural follow-up question is that, to you, I know consciousness means different things to different people. What is consciousness to you? Because when we talk about machine consciousness, oftentimes people don't understand what consciousness is.
You're right. And it means a lot of different things to different people. And one thing I've tried to do when I talk about particularly science and religion is explicitly separate out two separate things, consciousness and free will. They're often combined in philosophy, though I've noticed more and more they're treated separately. And I think of consciousness right now very simply as our self-awareness, that we are aware that we are an individual separate from other individuals. And that, is something that's a very interesting question to ask. How would I know when a computer program, if it ever does, becomes conscious? We used to think there's the famous Turing test, that it's having a conversation with the computer. And that's interesting because, we all interact, I think, now with a lot more chatbots than we think, or, AI and chats. And it can be harder than you think to decide that it's not a person. I did have an argument with an online chat tool. They kept claiming to be a person. I kept claiming they weren't. So I don't know what that means. I hope I wasn't insulting someone.
That's exactly my question now, is that how do you measure self-awareness, right? Like if you speak to any of these tools that you mentioned, you ask them, who are they? And they have a name, right? They do things. They are active in society. They participate. So, what makes them unconscious, or what is how do you determine self-awareness?
I think it froze and I didn't get to hear your question. Sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah, it's this is the downside of Riverside. Like sometimes it freezes. No worries. So what I was trying to ask is, how do we know? How do we measure self-awareness? Right now, I want to draw your attention to. I'm sure that you know about integration information theory, and it is the theory of consciousness or how to determine if a system is conscious or not. And Christoph Koch, in his book, The Feeling of Life Itself, talks a lot about this, and I find it fascinating. And he draws it as on the x-axis, there's intelligence, and then the y-axis, there's consciousness. And he said an organism could have very little intelligence, yet conscious. And it could be on the opposite side too. Like you have a system that's highly intelligent, but lack any consciousness. And the idea here is that the definition of consciousness here is how integrated is the information. So it says here that it's a kind of the unified experience of information, and that's what consciousness is. Now, if that is the definition, then could AI systems be conscious?
That's a great question, and I think this idea of how integrated is the information is, I think, a good starting point. But I really do think consciousness comes down to how it's integrated and in what way it relates to each other. One thing that I think is really interesting, and I've been thinking a lot about lately, is really interrogating, why do I think I'm conscious? How am I experiencing things? What do I know and not know? And, I've had pets, dogs and cats, and very much they seem to be aware of who they are, right? They have a clear sense of that they are a thing different from other things. And the more I look at it lately, and some things I've read on AI, I'm really starting to suspect there is a combination of both the information you're processing, but there is a need to have that physically connected body, I think, to develop this sense of you as an individual person. I really wonder and question, can it just be enough how information is integrated, unless that information is also tied to a sense of being a thing and not just a collection of information? I'm not wedded to that point of view, but it just, when I look at how, kids develop their sense of who they are and my own experience of it, there may be other types of self-awareness, but I definitely feel ours is tied to being not only aware of all of our information, but aware of our body. Because it's funny, our awareness of our information ebbs and flows. Fascinated me lately when I have 3 kids and I think about their growing up. Like, there's whole chunks of them being young kids I can't remember right now, but then something happens. Like, I try to remember. I'm like, what were they doing when they were 5? I can't really remember. Something happens, and then suddenly I remember an event from the past in a way that it wasn't part of my memory in a clear way. So is that really integrated or not? And what causes it to come back? These things, I think, play really interesting roles when you compare to something like AI, where pretty much all the data is there all the time. Like, the data is not coming and going. It's stored in the computer. I mean, okay, maybe in the cloud, maybe it's on that hard drive, maybe it's over there, but it's a very different, even just fundamental data structure. So I hesitate to think it's just information integration, though I do like that as part of it.
Awesome. I want to go now to the talk you had on YouTube. This is a lot of fascinating stuff in that talk, and I advise listeners to actually go and listen to it. It's fascinating stuff, where you at some point talked about there are 2 sides of the spectrum. There's a spectrum that says the physical reality is the only reality, and there's a spectrum of superstition and magic, all of that. And you said, very interestingly, and I totally agree, that you'd like to assume that there is something beyond the physical because it's less boring assumption, and it keeps the door for it may turn out to be the physical reality is the only reality, but it opens up doors of exploration. Could you talk more about this, and then I'll ask follow-up questions?
Oh, definitely. I just think, as you said, to assume that the only reality is physical reality seems to, at the beginning, be kind of a very limiting hypothesis. And you can understand why, at some level, there are groups of people and philosophers who, really stick to materialism, stick to physicalism. It's a bit simpler. If all that exists is physical reality, it gives you less to think about. And we know that sort of up to this point, physics, science, we're very good at making predictions about physical reality. We've developed a lot of tools to measure it and describe it. But I think you're actually being very either naive or very limiting right off the bat, you have mathematics, which we understand, we know, and it's hard to argue that mathematics isn't real in some very convincing sense, right? And it's real in a different sense than physical reality. You also, I mean, the concept of something being real is strange. I realized as I thought about this more, but our thoughts, our imagination, the things we imagine have a reality of their own. I have to say, sort of independent of the neurons and brains and firing, right? One of the things I've thought a lot about as an example, just because I love playing video games and people like video games, right? The reality of a video game, where do you want to put that reality? Is it the idea the game developer had? Is it the code that the programmer wrote? Well, that's real in a very real sense, but is it the, actually just the electrical voltages in your computer? If you're playing it on a PC or a computer, is it just that? Is it the image on your screen? Is it the experience in your brain? Is it your thoughts? Like, a video game is real in many, many different ways. And many of those I just listed are not physical. The physical video game is just the electrical voltages in the computer or the light being emitted by your screen. You can pick either one. And so given that there are things that I think are manifestly real but not physical, now they're real in a different sense, but they are real. I think you have to go, okay, what are the tools we have as humans to better understand all of non-physical reality? And those have been philosophy, theology, sort of deep, a lot of non-Western, Eastern, Buddhism, Hinduism has really deep ways of getting knowledge through experience. And I think we have to take that seriously and say, okay, well, what can we learn from that?
Right. It's fascinating. Like I often like to just pause and think about like how fascinating that is.
Yeah.
You also mentioned the act of creation itself. You
Yes.
asked the question, and I had to pause the video and try to think about it myself. You ask like, draw or describe what happens when creation happens, and it's still mind-boggling. And then you followed up with saying, with talking about the analogy between the fetus and the mother, and how the fetus wouldn't be able to understand what's going on the mother's side. I don't know if I hope that I didn't ruin it. But if you can talk more about this.
You did that very well. You did that very well.
In your assumption or in your thinking, what happened really when it comes to creation? Do you have any answer to that?
What's exciting about creation to me is I think we know two things very well. I think physics has done a good job of capturing very, very close to the moment and the follow-up from there. Right? So we do know there is a moment of creation. We do know that the universe evolves. It wasn't static. It wasn't always the same. And from physics, there's a very, very strong indication. Look, we don't have the ability to measure what was or was not before creation. We don't even really have the ability to measure the moment of creation, but we can indirectly learn things. And I think there's a very, very strong sense that our space-time structure, what we think of as the physical universe, emerged from something that is basically either nothing or radically different, however you want to think about it. We often talk about the quantum vacuum state. So no matter how much more progress physics makes or how we understand it, the concept and structure of some part of reality that just always was, and out of that emerged our physical reality, is consistent with the best physics we have. And to me, that's consistent with the core sort of message of the Judeo-Christian creation story, this idea that there is something that always was, let's call that God. And out of God, through God's act of will, through God's love, however you want to frame it, emerged this physical reality that is now in relationship with God. And so I have both my sort of theological layer of it as well as my physics layer, and they mesh perfectly in my mind. I see no conflict or contrast between the two. They're just different sides of the same coin and different aspects of what went into creation.
I'm sure you're familiar with the philosophical notion that there are a range of cognitive capacities. So, like certain animals are good at very complicated things according to us, but they are really bad at other things that come naturally to us. So each kind of species have their cognitive limitations. Do you feel that these questions that we're involved in right now, like questions of consciousness, creation, God, uh, are kind of beyond our cognitive capacities to fully answer? Because we're not the only people talking about this.
So I think, this idea is are these questions beyond our cognitive capacity? I think are both a yes and a no. I think there are definitely things that we can imagine and think about that we can't resolve. There are questions we can ask that we don't either have the tools yet or quite the right framework to resolve from a purely rational reasoning side. Like reason can only take you so far. And one of the problems with reason and logic is you always have to make an initial first step that's an assumption, right? So I make the assumption that there's more than physical reality and then reason and logic from there. Materialists make the assumption that only physical reality exists and then reasons from there. Those two hypotheses at the moment, you can't prove one or the other. So there is an element, these questions that can't be answered cognitively. But I do think this is where as humans, the scientific revolution is great and it's done a lot of awesome stuff and it's really good at a lot of stuff. But I think in Western society, we've sort of minimized what I call experiential learning, right? And if you think about it, experiment and experience has the same root. An experiment is just an experience you repeat over and over under controlled conditions, and you learn something from that. Our experiences are almost more statistical. Like I have all of my life experiences, you have all of yours. The amazing thing about humans is we're able to share our experiences through language, art, and culture. And I think we can get information and insights into some of these bigger questions, not necessarily answers, but definitely insights and make progress through our collective experience. And that's something we have to take seriously. And that's what art and the humanities is all about.
And I love this approach because I felt the earlier approach embedded in the question that humans have cognitive bottlenecks. Although it's been talked about with like highly esteemed philosophers that they think that it's real. I am very optimistic. I think that the story of human evolution shows us that we are very creative. We created tools to help us advance, to eat more calories. We invented fire. We did a lot of things that perhaps were beyond imagination for the earlier humans. And right now, look what we did. We invented artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Machines that are, and I'm sure that there will be very soon more capable in what we do as humans in a wide array of tasks, if not all tasks. So I am optimistic that, and I'm excited I'm excited to be alive in a time where we have these intelligent entities. Whether consciousness is not important anymore. But we are living aside more capable machines that we have access to. I think this will help us expand our own awareness and our own consciousness and perhaps answer these questions. Do you think there are implications for this technology to elevate human cognition?
It's interesting. And I'm glad you asked this because how creative can AI get versus how creative we are is something I've actually really just started thinking about in the last month very carefully. And what can it answer that we can't? Because it made me realize as humans, we definitely come up with new ideas, right? As you said, we build these tools, we do these things to help us. And it's never really been clear to me, particularly in my own work, like in science, we like to talk about, go do something transformative. We're going to fund transformative work. We always do transformative work. When really most of what we do is incremental work. We take the stuff that's been done and we add something to it. And you get enough increments and then you put the pieces together and it looks like a big leap. There's been these moments that look even bigger, quantum mechanics, relativity, what Einstein did was huge, but even Einstein's work was coming out of a lot of work before it. And so AI is really, really good at dealing with a lot of information, putting it together and mixing it around in new ways. And that is a part of creativity. Where it's going to be, I think, more of a tool to help our creativity is that it can do that piece. What I don't know that it can do, and I'm going to be really curious to see, is if AI can get really good at asking questions that seem to come out of the blue. And that's the weird feature of human intelligence, right? Like this ability to suddenly ask a question that nobody's asked before. And I think it's our challenge, like in my other role as a professor, I think our biggest challenge in the education system is how do we maintain curiosity and asking questions and even teach people to do that when we tend to, like the other thing about humans is society tends not to like questions, right? If you ask too many questions or the wrong questions, you're you risk getting marginalized if you don't do it the right way. And so I think that partnership is going to be really key. It's going to be our question asking mirrored with AI's ability to just deal with huge amounts of data and point us in directions we may not have thought. So, in the framing of your question, I really like AI as a tool to help with kind of this playing with data and information part of creativity. But we're going to have to be that partner, I think, in giving it the questions to play with.
I love the small iterations that you talked about and how we are improving little by little with every generation. Do you believe on that note that AI is special in a way that it is, or at least claimed to be on an exponential curve where Ray Kurzweil will talk about singularity, a point where, the intelligence, becomes so powerful very quickly, like almost overnight, because it feeds each other, it feeds itself on an exponential in an exponential way. Do you believe in that theory, perhaps?
Not quite, and I'm very bad at predicting the future, so I could very much be wrong. But here's the piece that I think is missing in the exponential discussion of intelligence and the singularity. I think it has definitely been growing exponentially. We know computer power has been growing exponentially. Here's the thing about physical systems and reality. Most things, initially, when whatever you're looking at is, quote, small, do behave in a linear fashion, that the amount of change you get is proportional to the amount of stuff you have. This is a well-known thing. It's why compound interest is so lovely. When you invest young, your money grows exponentially. And so we see a lot of exponentials in the world. A lot of things start that way. Almost all physical systems eventually become what we call as nonlinear. The exponential growth is cut off and something else happens. You enter a different state. And I do think when it comes to sort of the computing power, AI, like we know computers get better because our chips and everything gets smaller and faster. We know there are the nonlinear limitations. You hit the quantum limit of getting so small, you're finally at atoms and molecules. There's thermodynamic limits where you're just generating so much heat, you can't cool it fast enough. So chips aren't going to grow exponentially, first of all. And then not really knowing what is the architecture that leads to that next level of intelligence, kind of like what we have, does strongly suggest that there's nonlinear features in this. And why do I say that? Because most emergent and complex behavior is also tied with the system being nonlinear. Those two things go hand in hand. Linear systems that are responding in this exponential way very rarely exhibit truly interesting emergent behavior. So the part I disagree with is this sort of exponential sense that it's only going to get faster and faster and faster, and then you'll hit the singularity the way it's described. I do think we're going to hit a transition point, and that's going to be very interesting, but it's not necessarily going to be through this exponential growth, this rapid phase. And it may take having a fundamentally different architecture and way of thinking about creating it. I think quantum computing is more likely going to be an interesting feature because you're just doing the computing differently. And I think that will bring in this more emergent behavior.
I think it all depends as well on where on the line of exponential are we right now. So are we in the beginning of that line, or
Right.
are we like on the top and we're gonna hit the bottleneck? This is also the question of the future. We don't know. So you earlier in the beginning of the conversation, you kind of brushed off, I would say, the ability that consciousness could be an emergent property of AI, believing that humans are biological and we have a body and it's a different sense of being than computer systems. I'm curious to know from a physics point of view, like what emergent properties do you think AI will have besides consciousness?
That is a really good question. One of the things that I think is really interesting about our own brains, right, is very often we make the analogy to the brain basically being like your hard drive. And so that it's kind of the core, and it acts just like a computer and everything comes from that. And that's where you get all your features. And to the degree that consciousness is real, people will talk about it being an emergent property of the complex interactions of your brain. I actually really, and this is more because of free will than consciousness, but because of my belief or acceptance of a non-physical reality, I think certain features of who we are as humans and how we think of ourselves come from the fact that we can actually basically access aspects of non-physical reality. And the reason that happens is because of our brain and our brain structure. And that is an emergent property of our brain. And so for me, the brain is much more like the screen of your computer, the keyboard, the camera, the microphones. It is the interface between physical and non-physical reality. So if you think of a computer as sort of three things: the person interacting with it, the screen and all of that you're interacting with in the keyboard, and the hard drive underneath. I feel like the hard drive underneath, that part of us is actually the non-physical part of us, non-physical reality. The screen and all of that is the brain that's interacting with it. And then rest of physical reality is the people outside the screen and all that. And what I like about this model is most emergent properties, right, are transition points in a system. So when I think about the foam, if I just have a few molecules, soap molecules, I don't have a foam. If I have one bubble or two bubbles, I don't have a foam. If I got about 10 or 12 bubbles, I start to get behavior that's foam-like. And then there's a smooth transition to more and more different behaviors. So if you think about brain architecture from this way as a coupling between non-physical and physical reality, you can sort of understand why some creatures might just have consciousness, other creatures might have free will and consciousness, depending on the emergent properties of their brain and how it interacts. I think a lot of that has to do with the details of the physics of the brain, and the physics of a computer is very different. So my initial guess is the current computers won't have that level of emergent property. So what emergent property might they have? I think it has to do with some of the things we're seeing now, is the more straightforward sort of computational abilities, where one of the real challenges for AI traditionally, historically, has been to generalize something they learned and were trained on data X to be able to apply it to data Y. So like it might be really, really good at language, but it can't do anything with images. I think if you get the AI right, the emergent property could be the structures that form now are able to be more general and deal with different things. And I'm totally making guesses here, but those are sort of the things I distinguish between, because I have to say it, and I think some people will be like, oh, all that non-physical stuff, what are you doing? That's all kind of hokey. But I really do think when we think about things like free will, our ability to make choices and all of this, if you don't expand your model to include the non-physical, you're not going to make progress. And once you expand it, what do you want to think about? You want to think about the brain as an interface between the two, because all things have interfaces, and that's where interesting stuff happens.
You also talk about free will a lot. You also mention it now.
Yes.
So What's your conclusion? Do you think we have free will or we don't? And I'm asking you this because I recently also read a book called Conversations with God. Pretty impressive book. And they said, of course, we have free will, and our purpose in life is to create. And God wants us to create, and that's basically what is mentioned. So, do you think you agree, or do you think we are not in the driver's seat?
Oh, I love that. And I totally agree. I think what confuses the conversation about free will, I think a lot of times, is two things. One, on the one hand, I think we all manifestly deeply have experienced moments where we know we've made a choice, or we believe we've made a choice that was freely our choice. So it's very, very hard for us to talk, act, and think like we don't have choices. At the same time, we're very aware of the things we don't have any control over, right? I know I can't just start flapping my arms and fly. We know our brains do definite things, like under the influence of alcohol, I actually don't function as well, right? The brain is both limited and free. And so I think that the question is never, do we have free will or not? It's sort of like the way I react to the question of, does God exist or not? I don't think that's a reasonable or a useful framing of it. The question really is, what is reality and what are its properties? And then as I think through that, are those reasonable to call God or not? And I think it's the same with free will. I think there are definitely things that are acts of will, things that we make decisions about. And I think our creativity is part of that. I think the big part for me is those rare moments in life where you really are choosing, like, I really want to be this type of person. I really want to do this sort of thing. And then you actually commit to the actions required to train your brain and body to do that. Like that combination of recognizing that it's not just wanting to do it. I have to actually train my brain and body now to do it. So I think free will, these choices always come in combination with a lot of hard work. And that's what creativity is too.
So this begs the question of what is our purpose? What is the purpose of life? And I know that the Roman emperor who talks a lot about purpose, and I forgot his name. But in your mind, from your experience, what is the purpose of all of this?
I think I caught the end of the question. There's another little bit froze there, but the question of what is our purpose, in my view, I really come back to it's to be in relationship with each other, with creation, and with God. Like relationship and change and growth, I think is the purpose of life, right? And that, I don't know, it's only been recently that I've really thought through this part about change. Like if you think about the world we live in, it's rather weird that time as an axis and a direction of space and time together is kind of always moving forward. You need time to have change, right? And that change, is one of the most consistent things. Like all of our physics is about a physics of developing models of how things change, right? If everything was perfectly static, there'd be nothing interesting to study. And change and growth are kind of analogous. Like they're very similar words for the same thing. You've mentioned evolution over time, right? We as a species have evolved. We as individuals hopefully grow and change in our life. And so these two things I think go hand in hand. We, as much as I think we have free will, I also know it's almost impossible to achieve, grow, change, or do anything in isolation on your own, right? We're always getting help from other people, working with others, working through relationship. And for me, as someone who believes in God, I think it's the same thing with God. God is fundamentally about a relationship, which is a very, late idea in human history that God was someone to have a relationship with versus someone to just worship and sacrifice to get things to happen, right? And then when I look at most of the major world religions now, they've all kind of reached this point of it's about relationship. And so for me, I think if I had to put it in one word, the purpose of life is relationship. If I'm allowed 3 words, it's relationship and growth.
Yeah, definitely. I've been thinking a lot about this question particularly, and if you ask me what is the purpose of life, and I'm sure you would probably agree with me that before answering the question, you need to know what are the givens in any math equation, right?
Right.
And in my belief is that the given, before we answer the question of what is my purpose and what's the purpose of humanity, we need to understand the backstory. We really need to understand how creation actually happened. And then only then, like once we uncover all the mysteries, only then we can decide as humanity what do we want to do with it. Like we can say, okay, we need to go and conquer Mars, or we need to cure all diseases on Earth, because that's also some sort of like there's two camps. There's the camp of Elon Musk who's saying, oh, let's go and make humans multiplanetary, but there are other people who are saying, oh, let's fix all the problems on Earth. So I feel that without actually uncovering all the origin story and understanding how we come to where we are right now with concrete evidence, and then we can decide what we want to do with life in general. But I'm curious about what do you think about these two camps, and on which side are you on?
Well, first, it's very interesting. I had never actually thought about understanding it from the very beginning. I love that framing. So it's interesting when you talk about these camps of explore, go out, or solve the problems here. I like to talk about in certain places. I actually wrote my college essay on, I quoted Star Trek at the beginning of the essay, Space, the Final Frontier, and argued that unless we figure out how to colonize space, we're going to wipe ourselves out. And so we need more room or we're going to, be in trouble. And one of the other fun things, I'll make a reference briefly. You know, I mentioned the podcast FGBT that I'm on. We do like to talk a lot about potential apocalypses. And I'm known on that for being the apocalypse denier. I'm the optimist for humans. I think we're going to solve many of our problems. But I am very much firmly in the camp that we need to go and explore space. I do think it helps. It's funny. I kind of think until we get a slightly better solution to our problems here, we're not going to be able to explore space. So it is, we do need to make some progress here before we can do it, because I think space is a hard enough problem. We need a little more collectivity. I think even like the United States or China or Russia, I think as countries, we're not quite big enough to have that collective resources and need. Yes, we made it to the moon. Okay, we might make it to Mars, but I think to truly be successful in expanding into space, we probably have to do better here first. But I went into physics to go into space, even though I then studied bubbles and foam. So I'm not sure what that has to do with going to space. I am definitely fully in the camp of we've got to colonize space. I do think we have to solve some of our problems before we'll be able to do that. And it would be great to solve all of them, but I don't think we're going to do that.
Any final notes? Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to talk about? And how can people find you and find your podcast?
Great. So final notes. No, I think we covered most of it. This was very exciting. I mean, I will say one little thing. You know, it's still funny. We as scientists like to name things in very dramatic ways. And right now I find the use of artificial intelligence kind of this tricky thing. It's not quite intelligence the way we are, but it is certainly very good at doing things. And I always find the word artificial kind of funny, because I get why we call it artificial, because it's not human, but it's still like it's made from real stuff. So it's kind of real, but that's just my funny little aside. But no, I love the conversation. People want to find me. I do have a website, denninmichael.com. So that's where many things are stored. On most of like Twitter and LinkedIn and social media, I'm just at Dennin Michael. The one weird thing is on YouTube, my channel is michaeldennin.com. You actually put my name in the right order. And that's where you can find my Physics of X, which is something I just started this year. I did a whole bunch of episodes, had a little bit of a pause. I'm trying to figure out what to do next, but that's part of my just science general outreach. I have some fun stuff there. I mentioned at the beginning the Divine Science book. So that's Divine Science, Finding Reason at the Heart of Faith. And then the really fun podcast I'm regularly involved in is FGGBT. You can just find that on fgggbt.com. And like I said, we do a lot of fun stuff. Everything from, we've done the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Flintstones, Jetsons, to shows like Black Mirror, movies. We've done, of course, Star Trek and Star Wars, and the whole MCU universe we try and do. So we really have fun explaining the different aspects. And there's a lot in there about AI and, whether we should go to Mars or the moon or whether an apocalypse is going to happen. So I think people would really enjoy that podcast for the fun we have.
Professor Dennin, thank you for taking time.
Thank you.